Hi, and welcome to Chapter 1, Objective 8, which is where we're going to look at some of the trends in the overall economy. In this particular chapter, it applies a lot more to the macroeconomic class than it does the microeconomic class. Last objective was more micro-centered. But let me go ahead and share my screen with you, and we'll jump right into it. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some of the things that we'll be studying in macroeconomics. And so the first one is a country's standard of living depends on its ability to produce things. So we talk about this particular principle because what we are able to combine together, and when we take a look at this, the resources that we have as a society, and we're going to talk about it more in chapter 2, but if we take land, labor, and capital, these are the factors of production, and we combine them together in the most efficient, best processes, highest productivity methods, we get output. So as output, or what we'll term it as well in popular press would be growth, okay, growth. So as our output increases, it means that we need more of these factors of production. And our first model in chapter 2 really goes to understanding the differences of these and how households owning land, labor, and capital are intertwined with businesses which control economic growth. So over time, U.S. incomes have grown about 2% per year. We want to be a little careful about saying incomes, because if the incomes grow at 2%, but prices rise by 4%, then we're actually worse off by 2%. So these are some things we get into when we talk more about economic data. This is what we call gross domestic capital, okay, gross domestic product, GDP. So we take and GDP is just the output of everything that we produce within the U.S. divided by our population. And population would be anyone 16 years or over. Notice a few things. This particular table comes from the Federal Reserve Economic Database, which I use a lot in the macroeconomics courses. So the Federal Reserve is who houses this data, okay? Help if I can spell today. Okay, so we can see that if we look all the way back in the 1950s, we have a very low output per population. And that's grown significantly over time, particularly when we started trading in the world economy. Now, each of these, and you'll see every time you pull up any data from the Federal Reserve Economic Database, or FRED, you're going to see these shaded lines. These shaded lines are important because they tell us that during this time period, we had a recession. Or more commonly, what is a recession? It is 2, depending on the author you read, 2-3 consecutive decreases in GDP. So we use a lot of terms than popular press to talk about this output idea. The first one is growth. How do we measure economic growth? We do so by GDP. We also talk about things like recessions. So recession, again, 2 to 3 consecutive downturns in GDP or decreases in GDP. We talk about business cycles. Okay, and where we're at in the business cycle has a lot to do with what GDP looks like. So all of these things are used to measure, and we talk about them in terms of the output of a particular country. If you want to, you can take a look at the World Factbook comparison of GDP per capita. Again, that's the GDP using a thing called purchasing power parity. All at this point you need to know what that means is that we have equated differences in currencies. Those have been adjusted for. So differences in currencies don't really matter. When we look at this chart, it allows us to compare countries with countries. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that just really quickly. And if you go ahead and click on it, you'll see how the GDP World Factbook, what it looks like. Okay. So again, kind of talking about this, the idea of productivity, and a really easy way to talk about productivity is to simply say, at this point, we'll get into it more deeply in the macroeconomic course, is to say what are our outputs, in this case GDP, divided by our inputs. That is just really a very easy way to talk about productivity. And obviously we want the most amount of output for a given amount of inputs. Think about technology and all of those things which allow us to be more productive. And so we're going to talk more about that as we move throughout the macroeconomics course. If you want to look specifically at countries and a comparison of productivity, you can go ahead and click on here. And this is from the OEDC, which is the economic data comparison kind of things that we look at, and it's from the statistical models that we have. The ninth principle talks a little bit about this idea of prices and rising prices. So when we talk about inflation, inflation is just a general rise in the price level over time. So an increase in prices over time. Okay. We're interested in this we're interested in this because if prices go up, essentially what happens is it makes the value of our dollar go down. Okay? So it takes us more dollars to buy the same amount of goods and services. We can also have deflation, and deflation is a decrease of prices over time. And that likewise would make our money more valuable. What causes inflation? Well, there are numerous causes of inflation, which we'll study in chapter 24. But one of them is the idea of things like monetary easing. Mostly what causes inflation. We can have different types, demand pull, cost plus, but the one that we're going to focus on in the beginning, in chapter 24, is going to talk about monetary policy. Okay, at this point, one thing I think it's important for us to kind of highlight, because it's a misnomer, and that is to ask the question, is inflation a bad thing? And we're going to find out inflation is not necessarily a bad thing. Too much inflation is bad, but too little inflation can also be detrimental to an economy. The 10th principle, again, just another little, this was in the New York Times, and talks a little bit about monetary policy. The 10th and final principle is that society faces a short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So why might a government create some inflation? And this is why. Because as price levels increase, it allows businesses to increase the prices of the products that they have already produced. So imagine for a moment that I'm a business and I'm here in 2020 and I make something that is, let's say desks, okay? And I have $3 million that I have in inventory here of desks. Now, Corona's happening, people aren't buying furniture and those kind of things. So my business starts to slow down. I perhaps lay off some people or furlough them. Now, in 2022, let's say in response to this, kind of do it like this. In the meantime, in this 2-year time frame, the government is going to create some inflation. Let's say they increase the money supply. The more you have of something, the lower its value. So increasing the money supply decreases the value of money, which likewise increases the prices. So now in 2022, when we come back and let's say we have a demand now for desks, we have spent $3 million is the cost of this in 2020 dollars. In 2022, we could sell that same inventory for $4 million because prices have increased. If we're able to sell those, then we have, it's kind of a fallacy, we call it the inflationary fallacy, but this business owner might feel that they have made $1 million, when in fact we will find they didn't. But that $1 million makes them feel more wealthy, wealth effect. They might use that $1 million and they might put it back into their business in the form of maybe building additional capacity. Building capacity, okay, so increasing the size of their factory would be an example. When they do that, what happens is they have to hire workers to do it. So we can see then that because of this inflationary component that happens because of monetary policy here, we have this wealth effect, which means that the businesses may reinvest that. And when they hire the workers, that's going to decrease unemployment. Now, again, this is just a simplified example, but we're going to learn a lot more about how this process works. Okay, again, short run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. We also talk a little bit in this particular chapter about a business cycle, and this is fluctuations in an economy. Different economists believe in the business cycles in different ways, but basically, if we have a trend line like this, we would say this is an expansion. This is a contraction. And then we have a peak at the height. And at the very low point, we have a trough. Okay, so some of this does follow business cycles. And if you'd like to learn more about business cycles, go ahead and click on that link right there. So here's our 10 principles. Again, some of them cover micro more so than macro. So in a micro course, we spend a lot of time on these particular principles, the 4 principles 1 through 4. We do talk about 5, we do talk about 6, and we talk a little bit about 7 in terms of efficiency of markets. For macroeconomics, we talk a lot about people facing trade-offs, a little less than micro. We talk about opportunity cost, not so much 3, a little bit of 4. We do talk about how trade can make each other better off. We don't talk so much about markets, and we do talk a little bit different slant about how governments can improve outcomes. We spend a lot of time in these trends that affect the overall economy. So now that you have kind of a big representation to our course, whether you're studying micro or macro, I will make sure that you have a good analysis on how to do this. And until next time, we'll talk to you later. Thank you.